The Battle of Hollow Ridge. The morning started like any other for Daniel Harper. Quiet, predictable, the kind of stillness that came with living on the edge of Hollow Ridge, where the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away and the loudest sound was usually the wind rustling through the oaks. He liked it that way. The 40 acres he'd inherited from his grandfather were his sanctuary, a patchwork of fields and woods he tended with the same care he'd once put into fixing engines at the auto shop before he'd retired early. At 42, Daniel wasn't old, but he felt seasoned, worn in the right places, steady in a world that seemed to spin too fast for most folks. That morning, though, something was off. He woke to a sound that didn't belong, a low, guttural rumble, like a beast growling in the distance. At first, he thought it was a dream clinging to the edges of sleep, maybe a tractor from the Miller farm down the road. But the noise didn't fade. It grew louder, insistent, vibrating through the floorboards of his old farmhouse. Daniel groaned, rolling over to check the clock on his nightstand. 5:58 a.m. Too early for anyone sane to be working, especially not on a Friday in March, when the ground was still half frozen and the air carried a bite. He rubbed his eyes, swung his legs out of bed, and grabbed his phone, squinting at the screen. No messages, no missed calls, just the time glaring back at him. The rumble persisted, now joined by a faint clanking, metal on metal. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice rough with sleep. He shuffled to the window, barefoot, the hardwood cold against his soles, and yanked back the faded blue curtain. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. There, smack in the middle of his backfield, his field, was a gaping hole. Not a ditch or a rut, but a crater, wide and deep, its edges jagged like a wound torn into the earth. Muddy water pooled at the bottom, reflecting the gray dawn sky. A yellow bulldozer sat parked at the rim, its engine idling, exhaust curling into the air. And around it stood a cluster of people, maybe half a dozen, bundled in coats and hats, staring into the pit like it was some kind of marvel. Daniel's grip tightened on the curtain. His heart thudded, a mix of confusion and anger churning in his chest. He blinked, half expecting the scene to vanish, but it didn't. The hole was real. The bulldozer was real. And then he saw her, Margaret Voss, the self-crowned dictator of the Hollow Ridge Homeowners Association. She stood at the front of the group, clipboard in hand, her short blonde hair unmoving despite the breeze, her posture radiating smug satisfaction. Even from this distance, he could see the grin on her face, the kind she wore when she thought she'd won something. He didn't bother with shoes. Didn't grab a jacket. He stormed downstairs, the cold seeping through his socks as he crossed the porch and marched across the damp grass toward the trespassers. The closer he got, the worse it looked. The hole was bigger than he'd thought, at least 50 feet across, deep enough that he couldn't see the bottom clearly through the murky water. The bulldozer's tracks had chewed up his field, leaving ruts of mud and torn sod. His blood boiled with every step. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Heads turned. A few of the HOA folks, people he vaguely recognized from mailbox run-ins, shifted uncomfortably, but Margaret spun toward him with a gleam in her eyes, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Oh, good morning, Daniel," she chirped, her tone dripping with fake cheer. "You're just in time to see the final touches on our brand-new community lake." Community lake? He stared at her, then at the hole, then back at her, his brain struggling to process the absurdity. "That's my land," he said, each word slow and deliberate, like he was explaining it to a child. "That's my damn land, and you dug a lake on it." Margaret let out a little laugh, sharp and condescending, and rested a hand on her hip. "Daniel, we had a vote at last night's HOA meeting. Everyone agreed a lake would boost property values around here. It's a win for the whole neighborhood." He blinked, his jaw tightening. "I'm not in the HOA." She waved a hand, dismissing him like he'd pointed out a typo instead of a felony. "Oh, that's just a technicality. You live in Hollow Ridge, don't you? And honestly, Daniel, you weren't doing anything with this land. We figured it was time to put it to good use. Picture it, kids fishing, families having picnics. It'll be wonderful for everyone." His fists clenched so hard his knuckles ached. The urge to yell, to grab that clipboard and snap it over his knee, surged through him. But then he saw it. The way her eyes sparkled, the way she tilted her chin up, daring him to lose it. She wanted to fight. She fed on it, thrived on dragging people down to her level so she could play the victim or the victor, whichever suited her narrative. He'd seen it before, in the way she'd harass the Wilsons over their mailbox color or find old Mrs. Carter for her overgrown roses. No, he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Daniel took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and forced his hands to unclench. "All right, Margaret," he said, his voice steady, almost calm. "You win. Enjoy your lake." Her brows furrowed, suspicion flickering across her face. "Wait, what?" He didn't answer, just turned and walked back toward the house, ignoring the murmurs behind him. His mind was already racing, pieces of a plan clicking into place. She thought she'd won. She had no idea what was coming. By noon, the backfield, Daniel's backfield, was a circus. Margaret had turned the hole she'd carved into his land into some kind of neighborhood spectacle, complete with folding chairs dragged from garages and a card table loaded with lemonade and cookies. Kids ran around the edge of the pit, chucking rocks into the murky water, their splashes echoing with shrieks of delight. Adults milled about, some wading ankle-deep in the shallows, their pant legs rolled up like they were at a resort instead of trespassing on private property. Margaret stood at the center of it all, clipboard swapped for a megaphone she'd probably borrowed from the elementary school, her voice blaring over the chatter. "This lake," she announced, pausing for effect, "is a testament to what we can achieve when we come together as a community. A place for peace, for relaxation, for our children to make memories." The crowd clapped. A few even cheered, though Daniel caught more than one person glancing around like they weren't sure what they were applauding. Margaret beamed, soaking it in, her navy blazer pristine despite the mud underfoot. Daniel leaned against a tree at the edge of his property line, arms crossed, a bitter taste in his mouth. He'd come back out after retreating to the house, not because he wanted to watch, but because he needed to see exactly what he was up against. The lake was worse up close. The water was already creeping beyond the hole's edges, turning the lower part of his field into a swampy mess. He could see the soil darkening, the grass drowning where it shouldn't. There was no drainage, no liner, nothing to stop this from becoming a stinking bog in a week. Mosquitoes would love it, though. He almost smirked at the thought of Margaret swatting at them during her next community event. He pulled out his phone, keeping his movements casual so no one would notice. First call was to Tom Grayson, a surveyor he'd known since high school. Tom picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Dan, what's up? You free today?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice low. "I've got a situation. Someone dug a damn hole on my land, calling it a lake. Need to know where I stand." Tom whistled. "That's bold. Yeah, I can swing by this afternoon. Got the plat maps on file, shouldn't take long to check boundaries." "Good. See you then." Daniel hung up, his eyes flicking back to Margaret. She was posing for a photo now, one of her lackeys snapping away with a phone while she pointed at the water like she'd invented it. He shook his head and dialed again, this time his lawyer, Sarah Klein. "Daniel Harper," Sarah said, her tone warm but sharp. "What's got you calling me on a Friday?" "HOA dug a lake on my property without permission," he said, cutting straight to it. "I'm not in the HOA. Can they do that?" Sarah laughed, a short, dry sound. "No, they damn well can't. Private land's private land. They'd need your consent, a permit, and probably a dozen other things they don't have. You want to fight this?" "Already planning to," he said. "Just need to know I'm in the clear." "You are," she replied. "I'll pull the deeds and zoning regs, but if it's your land and they didn't clear it with you, they're screwed." "What's your next move?" "Filling it in. Building something else." "Smart. Keep me posted. I'll have paperwork ready if they push back." She hung up, and Daniel felt the first real spark of satisfaction since he'd seen that bulldozer. One more call. He scrolled to a number he hadn't used in a while. Pete Delgado, a contractor he'd worked with on a shed a few years back. Pete answered with a grunt. "Harper, you finally fixing that porch?" "Nah," Daniel said. "Bigger job. You got a crew free next week? Need a hole filled and a barn built. Fast." Pete chuckled. "A barn? What's the rush?" "Long story. HOA thought they could redecorate my field. I'm undecorating it." "Love it. Yeah, we're wrapping a job Monday. Can start Tuesday if you've got specs." "I'll have him by tomorrow," Daniel said. "Thanks, Pete." He pocketed the phone and looked back at the crowd. Margaret was still talking, Something about community spirit, her voice grating like a buzzsaw. The lake shimmered behind her, a muddy lie she'd sold to people too polite or too scared to question her. But Daniel saw the cracks already forming, literally and figuratively. The water was spreading, the edges crumbling. It wouldn't last. Neither would her victory. He turned and walked back to the house, the noise fading behind him. Inside, he poured a coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and started sketching. A barn, big, solid, useful. Something that'd stand where her mistake had been, a middle finger to her arrogance. By the time Tom showed up that afternoon, Daniel had a rough plan and a fire in his gut he hadn't felt in years. Daniel didn't sleep much that night. His mind churned with blueprints and revenge, the two blending into a vision of reclaimed land and a humbled Margaret Voss. By morning, he'd polished his barn sketch into something workable, 40 by 60 feet, high roof, space for storage, and maybe a workshop. He'd emailed it to Pete before dawn, along with a promise to meet the crew on site Tuesday. But first, he had a stop to make. The HOA office was a joke, a converted garage behind Margaret's house with a sign that read Hollow Ridge HOA in curly letters like it was a country club. Daniel pulled up at 8 a.m., his truck rumbling to a stop. He grabbed a folder with Tom's survey report and Sarah's legal notes, then strode to the door. It was unlocked, and he stepped inside to find Margaret hunched over a laptop, typing furiously. She barely glanced up. "Daniel, if this is about the lake again, I don't have time," she snapped, her fingers still clacking. "It's not about the lake," he said, leaning against her desk with a slow, deliberate smile. "It's about my new barn." Her head jerked up, eyes narrowing. "Barn? Yep," he said, popping the P like it was the sweetest sound he'd ever made. "Realized I've got plans for that land after all. So I'm filling in your pond and building a barn. Should be done in a month." Margaret's face drained of color, her mouth working silently for a moment. You can't do that." "Actually, I can," he said, tapping the folder. "My land, my rules. Your lake was illegal, no permits, no approval. HOA funds don't give you a free pass to dig up my property." She stammered, her composure cracking. "But the lake, it's practically finished. People love it. Then they can love it somewhere else," he said, straightening up. "See you around, Margaret." He walked out, leaving her sputtering, and drove straight to his field. The next morning, Tuesday, the air was thick with diesel fumes as Pete's crew rolled in. 2 bulldozers, a dump truck, and a half-dozen workers in hard hats. Daniel stood by his truck, watching as they positioned themselves around the lake. The HOA crowd trickled over, drawn by the noise, their faces a mix of curiosity and dread. Margaret arrived last, wild-eyed, her blazer swapped for a sweater like she'd rushed out mid-meltdown. "Stop this right now," she shrieked, marching toward Daniel. "You're destroying a community resource." He raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "A resource? Margaret, this was my land. You never had the right to touch it." "But," she faltered, glancing at the HOA members for backup. A few shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "We voted on it." "Doesn't matter," he said. "No consent, no permits. You're lucky I'm not pressing charges." Her face twisted, but she rallied. "Fine. If you're going to be unreasonable, I'll take legal action. The HOA has rules." "Go ahead," he cut in, smirking. "I talked to my lawyer. Your pond's a liability, illegal construction, misused funds. You want a lawsuit? You'll be the one answering questions." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, her eyes darting to the crowd. The bulldozers roared to life, and the first scoop of dirt hit the water with a wet thud. She let out a strangled gasp, clutching her sweater. The HOA folks watched in silence as the lake began to vanish, mud piling up where water had been. Daniel crossed his arms, satisfaction warming his chest. This wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about showing her she'd picked the wrong fight. A week after the lake was gone, Daniel found a stack of papers crammed into his mailbox. Not the usual HOA nonsense he'd toss without reading, but a formal complaint, typed up like Margaret thought she was a lawyer. Notice of violation, it read, claiming his barn was a visual nuisance and demanding its removal. He laughed out loud, right there by the road, the absurdity hitting him like a bad joke. She'd dug a hole on his land, and now she was mad he'd built something legal? He took the papers straight to her house, knocking hard enough to rattle the door. Margaret answered, her smirk so smug he almost admired her nerve. "I see you got my notice," she said, voice syrupy. "Yeah," he said, holding up the pages. "Let me get this straight. You trespass, misuse HOA money, and when I build something legal, it's a nuisance." Her smirk didn't waver. "Yes, the barn's an eyesore. Several residents agree." "Who?" he asked, leaning in. "Because everyone I've talked to likes it." "That's irrelevant," she snapped. "HOA rules state new structures must fit the community's aesthetic. Your barn doesn't." He laughed again, louder this time. "Margaret, I'm not in the HOA. And you know what does affect the community? You stealing funds for that pond." Her eye twitched, but she pressed on. "I have connections. I'll take this to court." "Great," he said, grinning. "Because the first question they'll ask is where the HOA money went. No approval, no receipts. Good luck with that." Her face paled, the smugness flickering. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I would," he said. "And I might call a reporter or two. HOA president steals land. Sounds catchy, right?" She froze, her mouth flapping like a fish out of water. For once, she had no comeback. Daniel turned and left, the papers still in hand. The next morning, an email hit his inbox. Margaret had resigned from the HOA, effective immediately. No fanfare, no fight. She was done. A few weeks later, the barn was finished, solid oak walls, a red metal roof, wide doors opening to the fields. Daniel threw a party, inviting everyone but Margaret. Neighbors showed up with pies and beers, kids petting goats he'd rescued for the shelter he'd built inside. From the road, he saw her watching, her face unreadable but her defeat clear. She moved out by month's end, and Hollow Ridge breathed easier without her. Spring came to Hollow Ridge softer than usual, the air warm and the fields greening without Margaret Voss's shadow hanging over them. Her house sat empty for a week after the moving truck left, then a young couple bought it, quiet folks who waved instead of wielding clipboards. The HOA limped on, but with new leadership, Tom Grayson's wife, Linda, took over, promising no more petty rules or power trips. People noticed the difference fast. Kids played in yards without fear of fines, and Mrs. Carter let her roses grow wild again. Daniel's barn stood proud, its red roof catching the sun each morning. The shelter inside hummed with life. 3 goats, a pair of sheep, and a donkey he'd named Buck after the stubborn fight that birthed this place. Kids from town came by Saturdays, feeding the animals, learning to brush them, their laughter drifting through the open doors. Neighbors donated hay, old blankets, even a few bucks here and there. What started as a jab at Margaret had turned into something real, something good. He spent his days tinkering in the workshop he'd built in the barn's back corner, fixing tools or welding scrap into gates for the pens. Evenings, he'd sit on a stool by the doors, a beer in hand, watching the sun dip below the oaks. It was quiet again, the way he liked it, but now it felt earned, like he'd carved this piece out of chaos himself. One night, as the sky turned orange, he thought about Margaret. Not with anger anymore, but a kind of distant pity. She'd thought she could bully her way into control, that people would just bend. She hadn't counted on someone pushing back harder. He wondered where she'd gone. Some other town to terrorize, probably. Didn't matter. She was Hollow Ridge's ghost now, not his. The barn door creaked as Buck nosed it open, ambling out to nibble grass. Daniel smiled, sipping his beer. This was his land, his life, and no one could take it again.